It is believed that the injuries were persistent with continuous trauma that were happening for approximately...
What if the one place you were supposed to be safe, the place that should have given you love, was the very place that took your life? A 10-year-old boy, abandoned by the world, subjected to abuse and neglect beyond belief. This is the story of Michael Miranda, a child whose silent screams could not be heard until it was too late. Imagine a boy with a bright smile that could light up a room. That was Michael. His smile showed hope, a hope for a better life after all he had been through. Michael was adopted by Jonathan and Christina Miranda, who promised to love him and give him a fresh start. For a while, it seemed like this might be the new beginning he needed. But instead of finding the love he was promised, Michael found himself trapped in a home full of darkness and pain. Michael's smile was a reminder that even in darkness there's a light. But that light would soon be extinguished, leaving nothing but silence. Michael had been through so much before he came to the Mirandas. He had faced abuse, neglect, and suffering. But when he entered his new home, he thought things would be different. He believed that this family would care for him and give him the love every child deserves. Instead, Michael's new life became a nightmare. His new home was supposed to be a place of safety, a place where he could heal. But instead, it became a prison. Michael's story is one that we will never forget, a reminder of how some children are not protected, even when they think they've found safety. My dear friend, before we jump into this tragic story, I ask you to take several important actions. Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this story. Every single share reaches more people who might recognize these warning signs and save a child. In the comments, write your city and viewing time. This helps me understand when it's best to publish similar investigations so they reach the maximum number of people and can save children's lives. My channel does well to bring you stories about children who needed protection, but didn't get it. Each such investigation is not just a story about tragedy. It's a lesson in recognizing dangerous situations. Be sure to watch other videos on the channel because knowing about cases like these could one day help you notice warning signs and protect a child who's in danger. Thank you for your support. It was a night like any other, except for the terrible call that would change everything. On September 24th, 2022, at exactly 9:22 p.m., the police were called to a home in San Antonio, Texas. The call was urgent. Inside the home, a little boy named Michael Miranda was in trouble. But the officers who arrived had no idea just how horrible the scene would be. When the police walked into the house, they found Michael's lifeless body. His small body, so full of potential, was lying motionless on the floor. His skin was pale and thin, his bones nearly sticking out from under his fragile skin. It was clear that this little boy had been through something no child should ever experience. Michael was emaciated. He was so thin it looked like he hadn't eaten enough food for a long time. As the officers looked closer, they noticed something else. Michael was covered in bruises and cuts, his body a painful map of the abuse he had endured. There were marks on his face, legs, and arms, each one telling a different story of hurt and suffering. The boy had been broken in ways that no one could ever imagine. The house itself seemed just as broken. The smell in the air was awful. It was the kind of smell you can't forget, the smell of something that's been neglected for far too long. In the laundry room, the police found dried feces, evidence that Michael had been forced to live in horrible conditions. There was also broken drywall, like something violent had happened there. In the corner of the room, there was a pet pad, the kind people use for animals, but it was clear it had been used by a human, a sign of how desperate and painful Michael's life had been. The room where they found him was one where Michael had been kept locked away. Police later learned that this was the place where he had been held for up to a year. As the officers moved closer to Michael's body, they found more things that made their hearts break. They noticed his small, fragile body had injuries, fractured ribs, limbs that were dislocated, and terrible signs of malnutrition. Michael had been starving. His body was so weak from not getting enough food, his skin and bones a painful reminder of how long he had suffered. His final injury was the worst of all, a lacerated lower intestine. This injury had caused Michael's death, and it was something that could only have been caused by force, by an adult kicking, punching, or using an object to hurt him. The police tried their best to save him, but it was too late. Michael had already passed away. His body was too broken to fight anymore. As they looked around the house, the officers couldn't help but feel the weight of what had happened. Michael had been a child who needed love, care, and safety. But instead, he had lived a life of pain, isolation, and terror. His life had ended too soon, and the officers could only wonder how long he had been trapped in this nightmare before anyone had come to help. The house was a place that should have been safe, but it had become the place where Michael's life was taken from him. And now, it was time for the truth to come out. Before Michael came to live with Jonathan and Christina Miranda, his life was already filled with pain and fear. He wasn't always in a safe home. As a young child, Michael had been through a lot. His early years were full of sadness, and he had experienced things that no child should ever have to go through. Michael had been abused, neglected, and hurt in ways that left deep scars inside him. There were even terrible stories about sexual abuse he suffered before he was adopted, though we may never fully understand all the details. When Michael was just a little boy, he didn't know what it meant to feel loved and cared for. He didn't get the chance to be like other kids who had warm hugs, a full stomach, and a sense of safety. Instead, he was treated poorly, forced to live in dangerous situations where no one protected him. His world was filled with darkness and hurt, and it was hard to see any way out. Then, one day, there was a chance for things to get better. Michael was adopted by Jonathan and Christina Miranda, a couple who promised to take him in and give him the love and care he had never known. At first, it seemed like a dream come true. Michael was told that this was his fresh start, a new life where he could be happy and safe. But that promise didn't last long. Jonathan and Christina Miranda, who had appeared kind and loving at first, quickly showed their true colors. They had promised Michael safety, but what they delivered was a nightmare. They seemed like the perfect parents at first, but their actions were far from loving. Michael's new home, which was supposed to be his sanctuary, turned out to be the worst place for him. The love he thought he would receive never came. Instead, Michael found himself trapped in a life of cruelty, where he was treated with violence and neglect. His fresh start was nothing but an illusion, and the nightmares from his past only grew worse. Michael's adoption was meant to be the turning point in his life, but it only made his suffering worse. The hope he had was shattered, and the boy who deserved so much more was left broken and lost. Michael's life inside the Miranda home was nothing like he had hoped it would be. It wasn't the safe place he dreamed of. Instead, it was a house full of fear, pain, and confusion. Every single day, Michael faced cruelty he couldn't escape. Michael wasn't just mistreated sometimes. The abuse was constant. He was beaten with paddles, sharp and hard, leaving marks on his small body. Sometimes, the Mirandas would use a wooden paddle or a rubber one with a metal inside. And every time it hit him, it hurt his body and his spirit. Michael would be forced to stand for hours at a time, his legs aching, his body trembling from exhaustion. He had to be perfectly still, no moving, no talking, just waiting in silence for it to end. But the pain didn't stop there. Michael was often left without food, starving in a house full of people who were supposed to care for him. His stomach would growl in hunger, but there was no food to fill it. He had no strength, no energy, but he was still forced to endure. His body grew weak and frail, and his smile, once bright, began to fade as the days passed. The other children in the house could hear Michael's cries, and sometimes they saw the beatings too. They were scared. They had seen the way Michael was treated, but they were afraid to speak out. The Mirandas made sure they stayed quiet. But despite their fear, the other kids did what they could. They whispered their stories to the police when they finally asked. "He was beaten every day," one of the children said. "He couldn't even cry anymore without getting hurt." But the beatings were just part of Michael's suffering. The worst part was the way Jonathan and Christina controlled him with fear. They didn't just hurt him physically, they hurt him in his heart. They made him believe that if he was good enough, if he followed all the rules, they would love him. They would promise him food, kindness, and care, but only when he was quiet and obedient. Every time he did something wrong, the punishment was harsh, and the hope for kindness would vanish. Michael was isolated, left alone in his room for long periods of time. He had no friends, no one to talk to, no one to protect him. Jonathan and Christina kept him away from everyone, even the other children. They wanted to control his every move, every word, and they used his love for them against him. It wasn't just physical violence they used, it was mental cruelty too. They made Michael believe that if he didn't do exactly what they said, they wouldn't love him anymore. They promised him happiness and safety, but only if he stayed silent and did everything perfectly. If he didn't, there would be more pain, more hunger, more loneliness. This is what broke Michael's spirit the most. He loved them, and he wanted to believe their promises. He wanted to believe that someday they would love him for real. But every day he was reminded that the only thing he had to look forward to was pain. The Mirandas didn't just abuse Michael's body. They twisted his heart and mind. They made him feel small and unworthy. They took advantage of his love and hope and used it to control him. In the end, Michael never got to experience what a real family should feel like. He never knew what it was like to be loved without fear. His life inside the Miranda house was one of constant abuse, both physical and emotional. Every day was a fight to survive, and Michael fought with everything he had. But in the end, he didn't make it out. The abuse Michael faced wasn't just what happened to him. It was the hope he was never allowed to have. It was the kindness he never received. And it was the love that was taken from him in the most cruel way imaginable. When the medical examiner carefully looked at Michael's body, the truth of the abuse he had suffered became painfully clear. Michael's body, which had once been full of life and energy, was now a broken shell, a reminder of the cruelty he had endured. The autopsy results told a story of years of suffering, each injury leaving a scar that could never be erased. Michael's body had abrasions all over it, scrapes and cuts from being hurt repeatedly. His skin was marked with lacerations, deep enough to leave permanent reminders of the beatings and the violence he faced. The examiner could see that these injuries were not accidents. They were signs of a child who had been physically punished over and over again, with no mercy. Michael's legs, arms, and back were all covered with bruises. Some of the bruises were old, others were new, showing that the abuse didn't stop. The bruises on his back were especially shocking, as they seemed to show that someone had hit him again and again. His ribs were fractured, and some were healing while others were fresh, proof that the pain had been ongoing for a long time. His arms and legs also showed signs of dislocation, meaning that Michael had been forcefully handled, treated like a rag doll with no care for how much pain he felt. The worst of it all was the final injury that took Michael's life. The medical examiner found that Michael's lower intestine had been lacerated. This injury was caused by something so severe that it could only have been inflicted by a powerful blow, possibly a punch, kick, or an object being used to hurt him. This was no accident. It was clear that Michael had been intentionally hurt by someone strong enough to cause such damage. The lacerated intestine was Michael's final blow, the injury that led to his death. It was something that a 10-year-old boy should never have had to endure. This wasn't just a simple injury. It was a result of someone deliberately hurting him, using their strength to cause pain in the most terrible way. This injury wasn't something that could happen by chance. It was a clear sign of how Michael's life had been full of cruelty. The horror of what Michael had been through didn't stop at the visible injuries. The emotional pain he must have felt is something that can never fully be understood. Each bruise, each scrape, and each broken bone told a story of a child who had lived in fear and pain for far too long. And when the final blow came, his intestine being torn apart, it was clear that his suffering was not just an accident. It was the result of someone deliberately hurting him, without any care for his pain or his life. Michael's injuries, revealed in the autopsy, left behind a trail of devastation. They showed the brutal reality of what he went through. His body had been shattered, his spirit broken, and his life stolen away by those who were supposed to care for him. The truth of what had happened to him was now out, and there was no turning back. Jonathan and Christina Miranda looked like any other parents at first. They were the kind of people who seemed friendly, who smiled for the camera and made promises of a better life. But behind their smiles there was something much darker. They were the people who were supposed to protect Michael, but instead, they brought him into a world of pain and suffering. Jonathan and Christina appeared to be caring, loving parents who had adopted a child in need of a home. But the truth was far from that. Under their roof, Michael was treated terribly, abused, and neglected. They were the ones who hurt him every day, physically and emotionally. And still, they tried to hide it from the world. They acted as if everything was fine, as if they were just like any other family. But their actions spoke louder than their words. When Michael's body was discovered and the truth started to come out, Jonathan and Christina didn't immediately admit to what they had done. Instead, they tried to deny it. They said they hadn't hurt Michael at all. In fact, they tried to shift the blame, saying that Michael's injuries could have been caused by something else. They even went so far as to hire a lawyer who tried to argue that Michael's injuries weren't from abuse at all. The lawyer's defense was that Michael had suffered from a brain tumor before he was adopted. The lawyer claimed that this tumor could have caused some of Michael's behavior and injuries, like his bruises and cuts. The defense argued that Michael's medical condition, not abuse, was to blame for his poor health. This was a big twist in the story. It made people question whether the Mirandas were really responsible for what had happened. But the truth couldn't be hidden for long. Expert doctors and investigators looked at Michael's body and found evidence that told a different story. They proved that Michael's injuries weren't from a medical condition. They were from repeated beatings and neglect. The fractures, bruises, and the fatal injury were clear signs of abuse. It became obvious that the Miranda's defense was just a way to avoid the truth. Jonathan and Christina Miranda couldn't hide the truth forever. No matter what they tried to say or do, the evidence was too strong. They were the ones who had hurt Michael, and now they would face the consequences of their actions. The world saw them for what they truly were, the people who took away Michael's chance at a safe and happy life. The other children in the Miranda home saw everything that happened to Michael. They weren't just bystanders, they were living in the same fear and pain. Every day they saw Michael being hurt, but they were too scared to speak out. They were afraid of what would happen if they told anyone the truth. The Mirandas were in control, and they knew how to make the children stay quiet. One of the children who lived in the house said, "We saw everything. We saw Michael getting hit and punished all the time, but we were too scared to say anything." This child's words were like a secret that had been locked away for too long. They knew what was happening was wrong, but they were terrified of getting into trouble themselves. The abuse didn't just happen to Michael, it was all around them. The other kids felt trapped too, like they couldn't escape the house or the terror inside it. They were constantly walking on eggshells, afraid that any wrong move would bring the same punishment Michael faced. The fear was so strong that they started to believe it was normal. They had grown so used to the violence and the fear that they couldn't imagine life without it. When the police started asking questions, the children were scared to talk. They didn't want their parents to know they were speaking out. "Please don't tell them I said anything," one of the children begged. "I don't want them to hurt me too." It was heartbreaking to hear these children beg for protection, knowing they had already suffered so much. These children lived in constant emotional turmoil. They wanted to help Michael, to stop the abuse, but they didn't know how. They had seen their brother suffer, and they feared that if they spoke up, they would be the next ones to face the punishment. Their silence wasn't because they didn't care. It was because they were too scared to do anything else. The abuse was their daily reality, and speaking out felt like an impossible choice. Their testimony, when they finally felt safe enough to share it, was the key to revealing the truth about what had happened in that house. These children had lived through the horror, and their voices helped bring justice for Michael. After Michael's tragic death, the police and Child Protective Services, CPS, worked together to understand what had happened to him. They knew something wasn't right. Michael was only 10 years old, but he had suffered in ways that no child should ever experience. They had to figure out what had caused his pain and what had happened before he died. The investigation started by looking at Michael's past. CPS spoke to people who had been involved in his life before the Mirandas adopted him. They learned that Michael had already gone through a lot before he came to the Miranda home. He had been abused, neglected, and hurt even before he was adopted. But the truth about what happened in the Miranda house was even worse than anyone imagined. CPS workers interviewed the children who lived in the house with Michael. The other kids were scared to talk at first, but once they felt safe, they began to share what they had seen. The police gathered statements from everyone who could help piece together Michael's life. They spoke to neighbors, doctors, and even family members. The investigation was long and difficult, but it was necessary to understand what had happened to Michael and to make sure those responsible were held accountable. Medical experts also played a huge role in the investigation. They examined Michael's body to figure out how he had died and what injuries he had suffered. The medical examiner found that Michael had been severely malnourished, had broken bones, and had internal injuries. They even found signs that he had been abused for a long time, not just in the weeks leading up to his death, but for months, maybe even years. As the investigation went on, the full truth started to surface. The more people talked, the more the story of Michael's suffering became clear. The Mirandas had been hurting him for a long time. They used violence to control him, and the other children who lived in the house saw it happen every day. The truth was undeniable. Michael had been abused by the people who were supposed to care for him the most. The investigation revealed the horrifying reality of what Michael had gone through, and it became clear that he never stood a chance. He had been trapped in a nightmare for far too long, and it was finally time for justice to be served. The day of the trial was a day that Michael's family, friends, and the community had all been waiting for. After everything that had happened to Michael, the people who were responsible for his death were finally going to face the consequences. Jonathan and Christina Miranda were in the courtroom, facing the most serious charges anyone could get: capital murder. This meant they were being accused of causing Michael's death on purpose, and if found guilty, they could face life in prison, or worse. The courtroom was full, and the air was heavy with sadness and anger. Everyone knew what had happened to Michael, but the trial was about proving it in front of a jury, people who would decide whether or not the Mirandas should be punished for what they did. Michael's story was being shared, and everyone was paying close attention to every detail. As the trial began, the prosecution, those who wanted to prove the Mirandas' guilt, came forward first. They were determined to show the jury the truth, that Michael's death wasn't an accident, and it wasn't something that could be blamed on anything other than the Miranda's actions. The prosecution's job was to prove that the injuries Michael suffered, the constant abuse he endured, and the way he was treated were all things that directly led to his tragic death. They worked hard to build a strong case against Jonathan and Christina. One of the most important parts of the prosecution's case was the expert witnesses. These were people who had looked at the medical evidence and helped explain what happened to Michael. Doctors and medical experts testified about the injuries Michael had, his broken bones, bruises, and the internal injury that caused his death. They explained how those injuries couldn't have happened by accident. They showed that the Mirandas had hurt Michael on purpose, using their strength to harm a small child who was supposed to be safe in their care. But it wasn't just the medical experts who testified. The children who had lived in the house with Michael also spoke up. They told the jury about what they had seen, the beatings, the hunger, and the way Michael was forced to live in fear. They talked about how Michael had been hurt every single day, and how they were too scared to speak out for fear of getting hurt too. Their testimony was emotional, as they explained how Michael had suffered and how they had all lived in terror under the Miranda's roof. The prosecution also showed how the Mirandas had tried to hide the truth. They hired lawyers to make excuses and say that Michael's injuries were from an old brain tumor. But the evidence told a different story. The Mirandas couldn't escape the truth. Michael had been abused, and it was their fault. As the trial continued, the emotional tension grew. Michael's story was being told, and it was clear to everyone that he had been robbed of a life he deserved. The question of justice hung in the air. Would the Mirandas be held accountable for the pain they caused, or would they get away with it? The prosecution was fighting for Michael, working hard to make sure the truth was heard and justice was served. When the news of Michael's death spread, the entire community was shocked and heartbroken. People couldn't believe that a 10-year-old boy could suffer so much, especially at the hands of those who were supposed to care for him. The story of his abuse and death left everyone feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers who heard about Michael's case were filled with grief. They wondered how such cruelty could happen to a child who deserved so much more. Many were also angry, asking how the system had failed Michael, how no one had seen the signs sooner and stopped the abuse before it was too late. Michael's case sparked important conversations about child abuse and neglect. People began to talk about how children like Michael are sometimes overlooked. There are children out there who don't have a voice, who suffer in silence, and their stories often go unheard until something terrible happens. Michael's story opened the eyes of many to the need for better protection for vulnerable kids. In the end, Michael's life, though filled with pain, also left behind a powerful message. It taught the community and the world that we must never turn a blind eye to children in need. We must always be willing to stand up for them, to protect them from harm, and to make sure their voices are heard. Michael's legacy is not just the story of the abuse he suffered, but also a call to action. It's a reminder that every child deserves to be loved and protected. Michael may be gone, but his story will live on, urging us all to do better and protect the children around us. Will Michael's story finally bring the justice he deserves, or will the system fail him one last time? The trial is far from over, and the fight for justice is just beginning. The truth has come out, but will the Mirandas be held accountable for their actions? As the evidence piles up and emotions run high, the case is still at a critical point. Will the jury make the right decision, or will Michael's voice be silenced forever? Make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and don't miss the next episode as we continue to uncover the truth in this heartbreaking case.